So hopefully my dogs will cooperate and continue with their naps.
Thanks. Welcome everybody that's flooding in. We're just going to give it a couple minutes while we make sure everybody that was on the wait list is inside. So give us about another minute and 30. All right, so I got the cue that we are good to go. There'll be more people coming in, I'm sure. Welcome everybody. My name is Brian Newhair, and I serve as the Dean for the College of Rural and Community Development, or CRCD for short. Thank you for gathering with us for our second presentation in the CRCD Research Speaker Series, which highlights our amazing and diverse faculty research and projects. The series focuses on community-based research, Indigenous knowledge in academia, and best practices for ethical research. Today's presentation features a brand new faculty member, Michelle Demmert, assistant professor in the Tribal Governance Department. In the recent past, she was the law and policy director at the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, served as the appointed chief judge for the Tulalip tribes, and the elected Chief Justice for the Central Council Tlingit Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska. Additionally, Assistant Professor Demmer is a graduate of the University of Washington for both her Juris Doctorate and her Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology. While as the Chief Justice for her tribe, she served as the co-chair of the National Congress of American Indians Violence Against Women's Task Force. Assistant Professor Demmert has devoted her legal career to advancing improvements and practices in tribal courts, and has also worked in various capacities of advancing domestic violence protection for women and children. She's also an appointed commissioner to the Not Invisible Act Commission and is on the Ninth Circuit Tribal Advisory Ad Hoc Committee, and has testified to Congress regarding legislation and current issues affecting women and children. Michelle, I'm very, very thankful that you are with us at our college and willing to present today. Please keep your videos and microphones off during the duration of the presentation to limit distractions and internet issues. After the presentation, please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And this presentation will be recorded and published to the CRCD website following the event. So without further ado, Michelle, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Goodness geez. I'm really honored to be able to share this information today. So let me get my screen up and running here. And so as you heard, my name is Michelle Demmert. My Tlingit name is Jakathat. I am Kahitzitan. I'm from the Mansfoot clan, and I'm a child of Takwanidi. We hail from Prince of Wales Island, and my family is, my father is the late Lawrence Demmert, formerly of Klawock, and my mother is Sharon Demmert. Now we are, and I apologize, I'm not the best at this, as I've said. Let's see, okay. And okay, there. Okay, I think we're good on the presentation. And it's just truly an honor to be at the university teaching about an area of the law that I have been involved in for so many years, as well as just the general issues of tribal governance. So before we launch off into the details of why we're here for me to discuss VAWA 2022, I would like to provide some information about the issues involved, the legal history that got us to where we are now, and other important events along the way, which will end with the discussion of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act of 2022. So first, let's talk about gender-based violence rates and Mmiw crisis. There's an important study commissioned by the National Institute of Justice that was completed in 2016, I believe. Excuse me. And oops, sorry about that. Excuse me. And it's an important study that was done by our colleague at University of Alaska Anchorage that made some very important discoveries, including one that has had a heavy negative influence on Alaska Native villages and our public safety issues that have led us to disproportionate rates of violence in our communities. And so I would like to share this short video as just a precursor to our further discussion.
The stories of American Indians and Alaska Natives are as varied and nuanced as the people themselves. But the latest study from the National Institute of Justice finds one troubling through line that links these stories: the experience of high rates of violence. Like songs and oral histories, science can raise awareness by quantifying the severity of violence. It's time to hear what the numbers are saying. The vast majority of American Indian and Alaska Native women and men have experienced violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 have experienced recent violence in the past year. Those levels are higher than the general population, but that's not where the inequalities end. The study also measures a range of impacts as well as services needed because of violence. What's behind those numbers? Let's start with the finding that for American Indians and Alaska Natives, violence doesn't discriminate by gender. Women and men share similar rates of victimization. That means almost 3 million American Indian and Alaska Native women and men have been victims of violence. To put that number in perspective, imagine if everyone in the state of Iowa stood up, or every resident of Orlando, Dallas, Detroit, Anchorage, and Atlanta combined. That's the scale of the violence, but what about the scope? The NIJ study breaks types of violence into 4 categories, and violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives is high across all of them. Take stalking, for example. It can be a gateway to more aggressive violence, and repeated, unwanted, fear-inducing experiences come in many forms. Lifetime estimates of stalking for women in the study are almost double those of non-Hispanic whites. Add male and female victims together, and that's more than 1.2 million people. That would fill 20 sports stadiums if every single ticket holder had been stalked. Being forced or coerced to engage in unwanted sexual activity is another form of violence, a form all too familiar to American Indians and Alaska Natives. For example, these mothers, daughters, and sisters face almost 2 times the risk of sexual violence with penetration as non-Hispanic white women. Overall rates of physical violence by intimate partners in the past or present are even higher, from being shoved to having a gun or knife used on them. More than 1 in every 2 women and more than 1 in every 3 men have experienced physical violence by intimate partners in their lifetimes, comparatively much higher than the physical victimization rates over the lifetimes of non-Hispanic whites. Of course, not all violence is sexual or physical, so the NIJ study also examines psychological aggression. For example, expressions of anger that seem dangerous or humiliating, or controlling access to birth control. Overall, psychological aggression affects more than 1 in every 2 women and men. Psychological aggression may not be as obvious as broken bones or bruises, but it is real. Among victims, 63% of women report partners tracking them, and 55% of women report being kept from family or friends. These are just a few findings, but remember, they are numbers that correspond to real victims who would feel the entire state of Iowa. Now picture if 97% of women and 90% of men in Iowa were victimized by people of other races and ethnicities, interracial perpetrators who violated the safety of their schools, workplaces, parks, homes, and bedrooms. Numbers alone don't tell the whole story, but they do point to a dangerous gap. Most federally recognized tribes don't have the legal authority to criminally prosecute non-Indians, even for crimes committed on tribal lands. So, what does it all mean? The impacts of high rates of violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives range from missed days of work or school to physical injuries. It's not surprising that services are needed, like medical care to treat injuries. But here's where the NIJ results uncover another glaring disparity. Almost 40% of female victims who need services can't get them, compared with only 15% of non-Hispanic white female victims who fall through the cracks. American Indians and Alaska Natives deserve better, and now there is science to prove it. These numbers are not abstract. They bear witness to real people, mothers, girlfriends, brothers, and grandfathers. Our hope is that this study will lead to a story of a new beginning, one where all of us listen to what the science is saying, what the victims are saying, and unite to prevent violence wherever it happens.
So those are some pretty startling statistics. More than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. 56% have experienced sexual violence, 55% have experienced physical violence, 48% have experienced stalking, 66% have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner, and overall more than 1.5 million American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. There is no study of this kind specifically to Alaska. So what about the Mmiw crisis? Sadly, American Indians and Alaska Native women are murdered at some of the highest rates in the nation. Alaska has the highest rate of men murdering women for the 7th straight year. This graph shows the rate of females murdered by men in Alaska. The red line shows the rate for Alaska, and the blue line shows the rest of the country. With the exception of 2 years, our rates exceeded those of non-natives, and usually significantly. So again, sadly, Alaska Native women are killed at 10 times that of white women. So what about missing persons? Well, Indigenous missing person cases in Alaska are the highest in the nation. And these are not per capita numbers, but actual numbers. From the August report, out of 772 missing persons, 295 were from Alaska. The next closest state was Oklahoma, which had 89 missing person cases. So these numbers are just really unacceptable. And we also think that these numbers are not entirely accurate because there's a fair amount of underreporting. So how did we get to this place? Alaska Natives have a unique legal history with the United States that spans 3 centuries, and we're going to give you a quick snapshot of that. The challenges confronting Alaska Indian tribes in creating safe villages for our citizens, specifically women, are distinct from any other sovereign in the United States. Indian tribes, states, territories, or the federal government, because Alaska tribes are treated differently under the United States law, mostly because of the timing of the Alaska Statehood Act and the unique structure of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and a few other factors. So in the 1800s, the Alaska Territory was purchased by the United States from Russia in 1867. 4 short years later, Congress prohibited the president from treating with tribal governments. So what is the importance of having a treaty? Well, it lays out government-to-government responsibilities to each other and defines other relationship issues. So what was happening during this time in the United States is notable that the Civil War had just ended, and the country was in the process of the Reconstruction era, a time, of course, when the United States was reintegrating into the Union the states that had seceded and determining the legal status of African Americans. The Alaska Territory was a far-off world, not part of this focus. So what about the 1900s? Well, a lot happened during this century. Alaska was a territory for almost a century before becoming a state during a time known as the Termination Era of federal Indian policy. The Termination Era was a period of policy making focused on ending federal obligations to Indian tribes with the ultimate aim of dissolving tribal governance structures in lands and fully assimilating Native people into the dominant culture. The policy has been widely repudiated, but many of today's challenges in Alaska are the direct result of the Termination Era actions that have never been undone. In 1958, Public Law 280 was extended to Alaska, and in that, Public Law 280 generally tribes and the federal government had what is called concurrent jurisdiction over civil and criminal matters within the tribe's territory. Well, Public Law 280 transferred the federal government's responsibility or jurisdiction to the state government. And so a month after Alaska became a state in 1958, the provisions of Public Law 280 were extended to Alaska as what's called a mandatory state. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was again another act at the tail end of the Termination Era that has a very big effect and impact on Alaska Native communities. ANCSTA was created in a new and novel manner to approach tribal land tenure. But rather than recognize sovereign tribal lands, ANCSTA created for-profit corporations and transferred tribal lands in fee to these entities to manage more than 40 million acres of land. So as we know, ANCSTA divided the state into 12 regional corporations and over 200 village corporations that would identify with their regional corporation. Many of these villages had corresponding tribal village governments, but with the passage of ANCSTA, no meaningful or recognized land base. So after ANCSTA, the only remaining Alaska reservation is the Annette Island Reservation in Southeast Alaska. Following the enactment of ANCSTA, several decades of confusion about the status and territorial authority of Alaska tribal governments ensued. In 1978, there was a landmark Supreme Court case called Oliphant versus Suquamish Tribe, in which the Supreme Court determined that tribes do not have the authority to prosecute non-Indians, even when that person commits crimes on tribal lands. This issue was a blow to all tribes, and most every Alaska Native and American Indian knows the name Oliphant. In 1997, specifically to Alaska, the Supreme Court handed down another blow to tribes. In the Alaska versus Venati case, the Supreme Court held that the tribes, because Angska lands were or the tribes' land were transferred to Angska corporations, they were not considered Indian country. And so that created a lot of confusion around that time as to what that meant and how that impacted tribes. The tides began turning, fortunately, in 1999 in, surprisingly enough, Alaska State Supreme Court case called John v. Baker, which held that a tribe had inherent authority to hear a custody case between tribal members in its courts. The court made this decision despite the fact that the tribe in question did not possess what could be classified as Indian country. The court determined that due to the central role that membership and regulating domestic relationships among members plays in exercising tribal sovereignty, jurisdiction did rest with the tribe, and it wasn't necessarily tied to the land. So, enter the next century. The 2000s are marked with embracing the role of tribal governments in addressing laws that support sovereignty. The Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010 helps address crimes in tribal communities and places a strong emphasis on decreasing violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women. It also required that there be a report, and in 2013, the Tribal Law and Order Commission issued a report entitled A Roadmap for Making America Safer. And in it, it found that the issues in Alaska were so dire that they devoted an entire chapter to Alaska. A couple of notable findings: the Tribal Law and Order Commission found that Alaska Department of Public Safety have primary responsibility for law enforcement in rural Alaska, right? Public Law 280. But that they're only providing 1 to 1.4 field officers per million acres. So that meant that nearly 40% of our communities lacked any law enforcement whatsoever. So without a meaningful law enforcement present, crime was regularly occurring with impunity. So in addition, the maze of jurisdictional issues that I identified previously, the remote nature of many tribal communities and other systemic barriers in Alaska created an extremely dangerous condition for Alaska Native women across the entire state, and especially those living in our small, remote, resource-poor communities. So without the extension of state services and resources to address the disparities in rural communities in Alaska, our Alaska Native women, children, and families suffered. So the report is really important, and I've included a link if anyone is interested in reading it. But in other notable actions in the last 20 years is William Barr's visit to Alaska in 2019. He came up, he went to villages, he saw some of the issues that he had heard about, and he announced an emergency funding to address the public safety crisis in Alaska, in rural Alaska. So $10 million was provided for immediate funding to support police in Alaska, child advocacy centers and rural hubs, expanding prosecution resources and Project Safe Neighborhoods, a lot of things that were to support the state. And what happened during that time? Well, the state of Alaska was having their own financial struggles, and some of this money pretty much went in to backfill some of the resources that had been cut because of declining oil revenues and other state revenues. So a lot of Alaska tribes didn't see benefit of the $10 million. Another significant event in this year, well, two events actually, is that VAWA was reauthorized. It was reauthorized and signed into law on March 15th, 2022. And it has an opportunity to make some really significant changes to our communities. In addition, in 2022, the state recognized formally Alaska tribes, which is really kind of curious in some ways because generally tribes are federally recognized and state recognition is just more perfunctory, but not in Alaska. So it was really another win for tribal governments and one we'll take. So all of this legal history is discussed in our Tribal Governance 101 class, a class that everyone should consider taking to learn about the often unshared information about the history of Alaska. I was in the class observing yesterday and the students kept saying, I never heard this in school. So anyway, Professor Illingsworth is really remarkable in his delivery of the subject. Okay, the Violence Against Women Act. We've heard about the high rates of violence and the jurisdictional challenge and legal barriers that have created the dangerous situation in our villages. We've also heard about the combined impact of Public Law 280, the Supreme Court Oliphant case, and the Venati decision, and the timing of other historical events in Alaska, which has left Alaska natives dependent on the state for public safety issues. Let's turn to solutions. And one has been the Violence Against Women Act. The improvements to the current law really came as a result of organizing and grassroots advocating, raising awareness as to what the problem is and what possible solutions could be. The Violence Against Women Act is one law that can and does make a difference. This picture here is from one of our first marches in Juneau during Tribal Assembly at Central Council Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska, in which we organized to demand that the violence stop and raise awareness about the issue. And during that Tribal Assembly, Tlingit and Haida actually created a task force to address the Mmiw crisis. So what is the Violence Against Women's Act? This law is co-authored by then Senator Biden in 1994 and signed into law by President Clinton. The law was created to address the severity of domestic violence, sexual assault, and related crimes. Since then, there has been a lot of education and additional laws and services to address the issues identified in the Violence Against Women Act. So the first passage was substantially silent about American Indians and Alaska Natives. Our grassroots organizations, women, men, and other allies mobilized and identified what the issues are and demanded that we be included. We had some provisions in 2000. The Violence Against Women Act is up for reauthorization every 5 years. And so that's what you're seeing in the annual dates there. So we had some provisions in 2000, but really the 2005 was a watershed moment for the movement. Each reauthorization has strengthened the law and included provisions aimed at enhancing safety for Native victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and trafficking. However, Alaska, hasn't always been included. So, as I mentioned, 2005 was really a historic amendment for Indian country. In VAWA 2005, it recognized the severity of the violence against Native women and the need to enact federal legislation supporting increased protections. So prior to the NIJ study and video that I shared earlier, we just knew these things. We didn't have an actual study that could verify what we knew what we'd heard, what we'd seen. And so in 2005, we started making the case for improvements to the law and resources for our communities, just like any other community. This enactment was also important because it had specific findings and provisions about the rates of violence. Other notable provisions include it actually had a tribal title. So there's in VAWA 2005, there's what was Title IX and included safety for tribal communities. It created a sex offender registry for tribes. If they wanted to, tribal law enforcement were granted access to the National Crime Database and created the requirement for annual government-to-government consultations, which has been really important to educate. These government-to-government consultations, let me just digress for a second, are so important. These conversations are so meaningful to have with the federal government. We just held our very first one in Anchorage last month, and it was the best ever. It was so well attended by not only Alaska Natives, but all other tribes across the nation. And what was most notable is, when I first started going to these consultations, it was almost all women. But in this last consultation, almost, probably not quite 50%, but a fair majority or a fair amount more of men were not only present, but they were speaking to the issues within their communities and providing recommendations. And so it's clearly, being recognized as a tribal public safety issue, not just a woman's issue. So VAWA 2013, we saw another historic amendment. So remember the NIJ study again, which said that over 90% of American Indian and Alaska Native victims were victimized at the hands of a non-Indian perpetrator. Well, because of the Oliphant case, tribes were divested of the authority to prosecute non-Indians who committed crimes against Native women on tribal lands. And in the state and the federal government who were supposed to be taking up those cases were not doing that. And so we called for justice, and VAWA 2013 affirmed the tribal authority to prosecute non-Indians in domestic violence cases. A huge win. VAWA 2013, unfortunately though, we learned that there were limitations. While we were so grateful that we now were recognized to have the authority to prosecute non-Indians who perpetrated violence against our women, and we could not prosecute if children were involved in that case. So let me just share a little bit. Back when VAWA 2013 was enacted, I was in the General Counsel's office for the Tulalip Tribes of Washington, and I had just finished up writing a domestic violence code for them, and VAWA passed. And so I thought, wow, what timing. And so I included provisions to be able to use VAWA 2013. And as a result, Tulalip was one of the first 3 tribes in the nation who were authorized to prosecute non-Indians prior to the date that was open for everyone else in the US, all the other tribes. And as a result, we really took this new special criminal jurisdiction seriously, and knew that it was incumbent upon us to collect data about who we were seeing in our courts and what the outcomes were. So in the first couple of years, Tulalip prosecuted, I think, 9 individuals in 11 cases. And we started looking at those cases as to what sort of data could be pulled from it. And we discovered that we started checking into how many law enforcement contacts those defendants had with the Tulalip Tribal Police. And we were only able to pull information from 2007, but from 2007 to 2013, those 9 defendants had over 120 law enforcement contacts. That's a very short time to have so many law enforcement contacts. I don't know about you, but I don't think I've had any law enforcement contacts in, I don't, other than me professionally meeting them to talk about these laws. And so to have that many contacts with, within a community really used up resources, and think about it, who was prosecuting those cases before? No one, sadly, no one. Anyway, but what we learned there is that in a lot of those cases, children were present or were also victims. And VAWA 2013 did not give us the authority to prosecute those cases for children victims. And so we were left either to the state or the federal government to take up those cases. And quite often, they just never did. So we learned a number of things. The types of crimes were limited. Domestic violence rarely occurs in isolation. Usually, we have multi-generational homes, and so there could be an elder in the home. There, drugs could be involved. There could be property damage, and so VAWA 2013, one, it required an intimate partner relationship, and it only authorized prosecution of domestic violence. So all those other crimes were not able to be prosecuted. And in addition, sometimes our police officers were attacked and or the defendant obstructed justice. And so those cases weren't able to be prosecuted. And that's not a good message to send out. So the other thing is, what about, because it required a domestic, an intimate partner relationship between the victim and the perpetrator, what about the victims of stranger sexual assault or stalking? What about trafficking? Well, unfortunately, those perpetrators, while they should have been prosecuted by the feds or the state, they were rarely prosecuted. So Alaska tribes were largely left out of VAWA 2013 also. Remember the Venati case? Well, the Supreme Court said that Alaska tribes had very little Indian country because of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. So the VAWA 2013 applied to crimes occurring within Indian country. So essentially 228 tribes were left out. So enter VAWA 2022, and specifically the Alaska Tribal Public Safety Empowerment subtitle. So this law has the potential to change many of the wrongs from the past 2 centuries that I've shared. Remember, in Alaska, the statistics are horrific and may be the worst in the nation in all categories. Domestic violence, sexual violence, homicide, missing person cases. And why is that? Well, remember the unique legal history and significant events and the bad timing that we had in entering this union really impacted negatively our communities. The issues since contact attempted to change who we were fundamentally, who we are as a people, but it didn't work. We are still here living our rich cultural lives, but not without challenges created by the federal and state laws and policies. So VAWA 2022, as I mentioned, has an important subtitle specific to Alaska Native Nations, the Alaska Tribal Public Safety Empowerment subtitle. And in addition, the next 3 slides I'm going to share include the findings and the purpose of the law. And what is really important here is that we were able to get in the findings section many of the findings from the Indian Law and Order report that I mentioned was issued in 2013, specifically Chapter 2. So we were able to get a lot of those statistics that that commission made in their study. And why is this important? Well, if there are legal challenges, these findings and the purpose will help in interpreting the intent of the legislators to support an outcome that will support, hopefully, Alaska Native tribes. And I'm just going to zoom through the findings, but I encourage everyone to look at those. Now, the purpose, I really think it's really important to look at what the purpose of this subtitle is. The purpose is to increase coordination and communication among federal, state, tribal, and local law enforcement agencies, and to empower Indian tribes to effectively respond to cases of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, sex trafficking, sexual violence, and missing or murdered Alaska Natives through the exercise of special tribal criminal jurisdiction. Wow, that is just so amazing. Our grassroots efforts had really been heard. Senator Murkowski was a champion of this provision, this subtitle. This was all her. She and Representative Young put this together. Pardon me. And really talk to advocates, to lawyers like me, to other tribal leaders and whatnot, to find out what was needed, how it would best be effectuated, and the House and the Senate really came through. So what will it do for us? Well, the law creates a limited jurisdiction pilot project. So unlike the lower 48, where all tribes who meet the requirements can exercise this jurisdiction, in Alaska, it's limited to 5 pilot project tribes per year. And the law will clarify tribal authority over Alaska Native and American Indians within the village. It addresses civil and criminal matters, including protection orders. But since we do not have Indian country, it makes an incredible provision for the exercise of tribal criminal jurisdiction. Previously, it was like, okay, we have jurisdiction over our people, our certain subject matters, but what is our defined territorial jurisdiction? Well, now we have one. Oops. Clicked on the wrong thing. So our jurisdiction is not defined by Indian country, but goes back to the definition of village from ANCSCA. So we have this we have this tribal village statistical area as represented by the program verification map of the Bureau of the Census. Talk about official. But that is where you would go to look at a village's territorial jurisdiction. So our jurisdiction is now defined. And what will it do for Alaska? Well, as I mentioned, it creates a pilot project, and up to 5 tribes per year can apply to participate. The pilot project will take time to implement. Let's remember Alaska, prior to the Russians, prior to statehood, Alaska Native villages were governing themselves, enforcing community safety. And really, do you hear much from the history books about just ways of crime prior to the 1860s committed intertribally? No, you don't. We know how to govern our communities. It's been the laws and policies since statehood that have really negatively impacted our communities. And so we need to be given some significant time to correct the wrongs that have been imposed on us, as well as the resources needed to build the necessary infrastructure to fully govern our citizens, just like any other community in Alaska, right? So in this, the Attorney General of the US has up to a year to define what sort of plan for approval, but a tribe can apply to become a pilot project at any time. And as I mentioned previously, the crimes that will be prosecuted are in this list here, all require the non-Indian perpetrator and a Native victim, with the exception of assaults against tribal justice personnel and obstruction of justice. And so it still requires some relationship in some ways. And then, as mentioned, of course, tribes in the lower 48 do not have this restriction of a pilot project. They just need to be able to meet the requirements of the law. So the Attorney General will select 5 tribes per year, and tribes must be able to meet the requirements of the Indian Civil Rights Act, which are very similar to the Bill of Rights that are in the US Constitution. And preference will be given to where the population is mostly Native and where there is no permanent state law enforcement presence. And so that's the priority, but other tribes will be considered, of course. But they did lay out a framework. And tribes can work together to apply. An intertribal court system is a great way to go. In part of my almost 30 years as an attorney, I was the chief judge and administrator of the Northwestern Intertribal Court System in Washington State, and we provided 8 member tribes up and down the I-5 corridor with shared resources. We had judges, prosecutors, ICW, presenting Indian child welfare, presenting officers, public defenders, code writers, and they would all go to these tribes and work within the confines of each specific tribes and would meet their goals for their tribes. And so it was really, it's a wonderful system for tribes who are trying to just really get their justice systems off the ground, and sharing resources is really also a wonderful way to go. The Northwestern Intertribal Court System was created in the 70s, right after the fishing decision came down in Washington State and the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so the Northwestern Intertribal Court System was primarily created to help tribes enforce those new laws that were on their books. And similarly, that could be Alaska, to help with enforcing the new criminal laws on their books. So what will be required of a tribe? Well, they'll have to have a plan for law enforcement, prosecutors, their court. They'll have to follow several Indian Civil Rights Act requirements, and so they'll have to certify all the requirements of the law. Let's see. But tribes should know that in 2013, tribes in the lower 48 had similar issues. And what did they do? The federal government created the Intertribal Working Group, and that was and it's still currently in existence. What it does is tribes come together about 3 times a year, tribes that exercise this jurisdiction and tribes that aspire to exercise this jurisdiction. They meet, they discuss the issues, what sort of assistance they might need, training on specific requirements of the law. And, it's been invaluable. It's been a very rich resource. And then let's see, the law also creates the Alaska Tribal Public Advisory Committee, which will be really important because it's going to provide a report to Congress on the justice systems and improvements that are needed, and a little bit more information about coordination and communication for that. Oh, sorry, I was just looking at the chat. Okay, And then also, you know, the duties of the Public Safety Advisory Committee, as I mentioned, is going to be looking at the justice systems and how these agencies coordinate. Can we all agree that we all want a safe Alaska? One that all people, regardless of native, non-native, whatever, you know, can live in a healthy, safe environment? Well, you know, Alaska Native villages have really been left out sometimes when it comes to the resources that are needed to really pursue that goal. But fortunately, right now, we have an administration who really has noticed that we need to improve justice systems for all of our nations in Alaska, or in the US, and issued an executive order back in November 2021. And, you know, President Biden really understands the issues and the problems. He says, far too long, justice has been elusive for many Native American victims, survivors, and families. Criminal jurisdiction complexities and resource constraints have left many injustices unaddressed. Some progress has been made, particularly on tribal lands. Well, guess what? It is our turn in Alaska, and we at Tribal Governance will be creating some programs and classes that will help tribes in pursuing this sort of being a pilot project tribe. So I'm really grateful that I can be part of this group who will be providing this invaluable service. So Gunas Chish, I really appreciate your time today. I know it's precious, so thank you for sharing your lunch hour with me today. Gunas Chish.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for sharing that. I learned so much. A really powerful presentation. I think we have a couple minutes for audience questions. There's one in the chat from Rebecca Young. She says, research indicates that Indigenous women experience violence at higher rates from non-Indigenous perpetrators compared to Indigenous relatives. How did the scope of the pilot project come about?
Well, Rebecca, thank you for the question. And you are absolutely right that the studies do show that. And so it was really a lot of us as lawyers, advocates, educators who educated Congress about the needs for our communities. While you know, nothing is ever simple in Alaska, and you know, one of the statistics that I shared was that nearly 38% of American Indian and Alaska Natives across the US lack the access to resources. Well, we think that's a higher number in Alaska, but we don't have that type of data to support it. But also, we also know that because of Public Law 280, tribal governments were not given the same access to tribal law enforcement resources historically. So we are 60 years behind other tribes in non-PL 280 states from accessing public safety resources for building infrastructure for our law enforcement. And so, so some of those details, you know, are known and considered, that because there's not just a wealth of information or wealth of money available, that we will be that tribes will have to, you know, get up to the level of having the necessary infrastructure to pursue these types of issues like law enforcement. Not a lot of tribes have law enforcement. They will need to have tribal courts. Tribal courts are often in Alaska are, you know, the judges are served voluntarily because there's no money for it. You know, so there's just, you know, those types of details are known, and And so I think that's why they created it as a pilot project rather than opening it up. But our work now is to make sure that the advisory committee delivers a very good report about what exactly the needs are and how we can achieve those recommendations.
Thank you, Michelle. Do we have any other questions from the audience? You can put them in the chat or in the Q&A feature. I think we have time for one more. Well, if not, or while we're waiting for them to come in, Michelle, it was cool to see at the end to hear about how the work that you've done and what you presented on connects to what you're doing with the tribal governance department. If people were interested in like taking a course with TG or, you know, connecting with you to learn more, how would they go about that?
Well, hopefully we'll have a current events 250 offered in the winter semester to address setting up a pilot project for tribal communities, but also they could register for 250 tribal governance 250, which is going to be a session held in conjunction with the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Providers Conference at the end of November. And in that, you know, whatever someone's interest is, whatever students' interest is, they can focus in on the topics that are being offered, and we can develop sort of, you know, a plan for how to achieve those goals.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing your knowledge and your time with everyone today. This event was recorded and will be posted on the CRCD website in the next day or two. And we will be having our next event in the speaker series is on November 9th. If you registered for this event, you will also get a reminder for the next one. And Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development faculty Charlene Fisher will be presenting on co-production of knowledge and her research on that. So thank you all for joining us. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Goodness, cheers.